Welcome to the Solution Spotlight series. Today's topic, vulnerability management for critical infrastructure. Hi, my name is Phil Siefert. I'm the Director of Strategic Alliances for CyberCX. Our sponsors today, CyberCX and Tenable, along with about 200 of you in the industry here in Australia and New Zealand, have joined us as attendees. Today's session is recorded and for later playback, but as well, we'll take your questions in the Q&A box, in the application, and then we'll cover those questions later on. Now, today's topic is very important and somewhat tongue-in-cheek. It's critical. And I'm doing a little research on this subject. Here's how I've worked out why it is so important. There's a good storyline. Now, as enterprise and government organizations that have critical infrastructure, OT, PLC, ICS environments in their organization, and they're aligning their IT and their OT together, that's really increased the attack surface, as well as the capability of those hackers, both criminal and nation state. They're actually taking advantage of that new environment. And what that means is that government is now recognizing the challenge of an increased threat vector attack surface. We are seeing the results of that in some critical infrastructure that we're going to hear from our panelists. And the government has responded with some new reformation in some of the legislation. And so we're having this bit of a perfect storm for OT and IoT environments that is driven by demand and the effects of attacks on critical infrastructure. The government responding, and finally, industry like Tenable making investments around acquisitions and investments in their teams around the OT environment and bring it together. So we thought CyberCX, we thought we'd share with you, some industry insights and advice and a bit of learnings actually, today. Now I'm joined by, three industry experts, three deep domain experts, both in cybersecurity and in OT environments. And, I'd like to do a quick introduction. So first off, to my left here, Jeff Bowler is what I would refer to as, a real specialist engineer in IT and OT on the ground here in Australia, and he's got a number of the answers. Now, Jeff, you're currently a senior security engineer at the vulnerability powerhouse, which is Tenable. You're based in Queensland, and you're a deep domain expertise in OT. Really is somewhat from hands-on experience. So, I took a look at your LinkedIn profile, and I see you do have that hands-on experience across a number of industries. But you cut your teeth as, let me see, I've got this right, high voltage design engineer at Transgrid. Couldn't get more basic OT than that, the way I see it. You've shifted into cybersecurity. You've been at Queensland Gas, PowerLink, and network security at Foxtel. All industries that are now going to be labeled under the SOC Reform Act as critical infrastructure. But please tell me, what was your favorite job? And don't disappoint me, because you spent 10 years at Bose, and I think that would have been a really cool job.
It was, and thanks for that great introduction, Phil. Had lots of great opportunities in my life, and a few grey hairs up here, so I've been around for the time. And thanks for not mentioning when I started at Transgrid. It was a while ago. Had the opportunity to work in OT and IT areas and see both sides of the fence. But yeah, Bose was most surely a good time in my life, and getting over to the US, meeting Dr. Bose, and commissioning big sound systems in football stadiums. So that was great fun. When you're doing that, you can pretty much have a whole football stadium as your own personal stereo system. So that was a lot of fun.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jeff. The first question he asked when he came into the studio is, who manufactured the mic? So obviously it's still with you. Listen, I'm going to turn next now to Marty Edwards, and look, I'm going to refer to him as a bit of the rock star in this panel today. No disrespect to either of you, but a rock star that has really reached some heights from some, what I have to say is somewhat humble beginnings. Now, you're currently, Marty, the Vice President of Operational Technology Security at Tenable. You are globally sought after as a speaker, and recognized as an advisor, and recognized for your experience. Now, let me start back at the beginning, because I did find it to be somewhat humbling in that, your first role was a field service engineer with NORPAC Controls in North Vancouver, British Columbia, the tundra of Canadian, and we've talked, and you are part Canadian and part U.S. And you've obviously had a lot of big ambitions and drive specific to that industry, because you've gone on to subsequent roles, really reach some heights. And I think you're kind of your crescent there. No disrespect to what you're doing at Tenable, was a director of industrial control systems at CERT in the United States, being recognized in the Federal 100 as one of the top IT professionals in the U.S. federal government. And I think those are really indications of the passion you have for OT. So tell me, what is it about this technology, this area of the environment that really drove you to reach those heights?
Thank you, Phil, for that flattering introduction. I'm not sure how cold the Vancouver area is compared to the rest of Canada, but to suffice it to say that I'm used to winter. What I would say really sort of sunk the hook into me is the fact that in the automation and controls industry, all of the programming that we did, all of the code that we wrote, manifested in physical things in the environment. So you were moving machinery, you were starting motors and pumps. So you had to be very careful about how you proofed your code and things like that. So I really got excited, I guess, at a young age in school when I could do things that had real life consequences. And it sounds like a bit of a cliche, but when I was in the pulp and paper industry in the Pacific Northwest in the US right after 9/11, I started to think, well, wow, if people can fly airplanes into buildings to cause us harm, maybe there's something to this cybersecurity thing. Maybe they can take our critical infrastructures and do things with that I wrote to cause us harm. So where I got interested in it. And that's why I still am very passionate about security of these systems today.
Thank you, Marty. It comes through in your CV. Really attained some great heights. So thanks for joining us today. And last, Mark Hofman, and I'll refer to Mark as a bit of the Bob the Builder. Now, Mark and I work together regularly, but Mark has built a career from the other side of the cold tundra, from starting in Darwin, in the heat and humidity of Darwin, and built a career, but also built a business. And a business that has become was one of the anchors for the CyberCX group coming together. 17 years at Shearwater, along with his founders, in building that. Now, Mark, your experience, that's 17 years here in Australia. Obviously, you looking back at that time, you were there before Nessus, before Tenable's original product. What was that like? What are the benefits the customers are getting now? From that journey?
Oh God! Before Nessus, we were just basically looking at systems and hoping for the best in some cases. But yeah, Nessus been using it since like 1998-ish.
Right.
So possibly even before it was actually officially called Nessus. So watched it grow and obviously help us find vulnerabilities in a lot of different systems that otherwise we'd have to do manually. So vulnerability scanners, certainly one of my favorite tools to use in the trade.
Thanks, Mark. And look, important to point out, Mark and the founders, they built a team of 70 individuals, on the back of tools like Tenable as well. So, with that, look, thanks for my panelists for joining and participating. I'm going to turn now, I think, to Marty to sort of kick us off. We're going to step back. We're going to start with, that IT and OT convergence. What's the story? What's the timeline? So that we've got a varied audience here. Bring us up to speed on where you think it's then going.
Yeah, and I can use some of my own personal background, I think to highlight this. So if you look back when I started in this industry in the late 80s and maybe the early 90s, there really was a separation between the industrial control system environment and what I would call, I guess, the mainframe computer environment, right? So on the business side, you had the IBM Big Blue financial systems, warehousing systems, payroll systems. And then on the industrial side, we had a number of VAX VMS-based computers that essentially ran all the industrial machinery. But the two were not connected. They were completely separated. They ran separate types of networks, and we really couldn't get data between them. I spent a lot of my early career in the mid 90s interconnecting those systems, right? We wanted to get the data out of the manufacturing environment into the financial environment so we could do bill processing, inventory management, and things like that. So now, I guess what you have is you have this convergence that's really taken place over decades where we've intentionally brought the IT and OT environments together. Now, every once in a while, I run into people that say, oh, but we're still air gapped or we have controls there. And I'll tell you that, you may actually not have a copper wire or a fiber connecting them, but in a lot of cases, those claimed air gapped environments are still accessible through remote removable media or things like that. So, you really have to kind of pay attention to these environments because they are so interconnected and interreliable on each other now.
Thank you. I think that's a good basis for what it is. I think if I could, one of the things I've learned again in the research here is the length of time. You mentioned the programming that interested you in this. The length of time is some of those, that infrastructure is meant to last. And coming from an IT industry, it's 2 years on a laptop, 2 years on a phone, server environments. We don't even know anymore because they sit in the cloud. I guess take me through a little bit about infrastructure here. Where have you seen customers, they're really bleeding this or using this technology or that infrastructure for 10, 15 years?
Yeah, absolutely. Often I think at Tenable we do that with our laptops because, it takes me about 5 or 6 to get the new machine. I need to come over to you guys every 2 years. That's fantastic. But yeah, no, it's definitely a different space. IT has that velocity and the change, even with their own software, In the IT space, lots of updates, new features, all those sorts of things. In the OT space, even with the products you're selling to the customers, it needs to be more stable. They want to put it in. They want it to run for a lot longer period. They don't want it to go through big testing cycles all the time to upgrade versions of software, versions of code. So it has to last a lot longer. Obviously, bigger concerns around availability and safety and all those sorts of things. So much more reliable and needs to be in place for a lot longer as well. So
a bit of color there, then, would you?
Yeah, it's an environment that is critical to life in a lot of cases. So you don't want to be making changes there a lot, which means that you do end up with old environments. I mean, one of the environments we looked into, we were working with 3-com switches, and that's pretty much ancient history now because that's been gone since 2003 or ish. Right. So, but those devices are still there. So, doing a lot of the work that we do, if you're touching those environments, you have the potential to break them. So you have to take more care, etc. So, but we'll go into that a little bit further.
Thanks, I appreciate that. Marty, back to you then. How the platforms interact, the platforms that maintain it, that the tools that we use to secure them. How do they interact?
Yeah, so they can interact in a variety of ways. The industrial control system environment quite often pushes data out to a business application that's on the enterprise or IT side, and there's a misconception that because we're pushing the data out of the environment that there's no or limited risk to the industrial control system. But if you understand how Ethernet networking works and TCP works, there's a bidirectional handshake that occurs. There's always an opportunity, to do something nefarious on the back of those communications. So in some cases, we have demilitarized zones with controls in it, and in some really strict control environments, they use unidirectional gateways or data diodes.
And okay, so I'm going to turn to you, Mark, for a second. We mentioned the DMZ. And an important understanding for us in the DMZ in an IT environment, how does it apply to OT, or does it apply?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're following the Purdue model to separate your environments for the different levels of systems, then you will typically have a DMZ between your OT environment and your corporate environment, which is where you often have the assets that are probably more susceptible to attack, which is one of the reasons why we often say, well, concentrate there, start working in that particular environment so you can secure and control that. Right. And the 80-20 rule applies there. If you essentially 20% of the effort will get you 80% of your bang for buck in that particular component. But more importantly, the way that the OT and IT convergence is working at the moment it used to be quite strict, as in you had one DMZ, and in one of the pre-conversations that we had with Marty, quite rightly pointed out that in modern environments that the touch points between corporate and OT environments are much more frequent and in different areas. So sometimes it's actually difficult to understand where the actual DMZ is that you're trying to protect. So that's one of the bigger challenges that organizations are facing now.
So let's look at Tenable OT. Is that part of the solution for that challenge?
Absolutely. I mean, we look at these networks and the risk you're managing with these DMZs even, it's the fact that, well, you're still allowing a communication pathway through it. So it's that classic risk of maintaining communication, allowing the traffic, but also trying to have the separation. So you're trying to manage that risk. You're trying to look at, attack pathways through those zones. And you also have the issue of these are really long-lived networks. OT networks might be running for 10, 15 years. And one of the issues is, they just grow organically. Right. Add a firewall rule this week or, another 6 months' time. And it's hard to keep track of all that. How are my controllers exposed? What are those pathways from corporate into the IT network or OT network and out the other way? And
in quite a number of engagements, we found, oh, look, there's another path between corporate and the OT environment, or OT and somewhere else. And it's been a valid reason why it was there. It was just not a known path that was there before. Yeah. So things change.
Okay, well, that's good. And I think you've offered up part of the solution, obviously, right? That's part of the equation. I'd refer to again, the SOCI reformation, these changes coming. One of which is being called out is these positive security obligations. And it involves three things. Again, I'm being educated here. A register of the critical infrastructure assets. So first of all, you've got to know where it is and what is it, right? Number two, you've got to, there has to be a risk management program for all of the infrastructure. And three, there has to be a sharing of near or real-time threat information. Marty, to yourself, are you hearing similar obligations and regulations in the European and the U.S. markets?
Yeah, absolutely. I think all countries and states are starting to discuss what do they need to do to shore up the protection in these critical infrastructure areas. So, every geographical region and every political system is a little bit different in how they enact them, whether it's guidance or if it's regulation and requirement. But really, we're all talking about getting enhanced visibility into these environments. Because quite frankly, when I talk to chief information security officers, many of them have inherited the requirement to secure these environments, but they don't even know how many devices live on these networks, of what type they are, what their legacy or pedigree is. So really, that first bullet that you mentioned about knowing what your assets are, that's a critical step to this. And if you look at these industrial assets, every enterprise IT person, and Mark referred to it earlier, would take Nessus and start scanning the environment to find out what assets were there. And we know from experience that if you take those types of active scanning or contemporary tools into an OT environment, you can actually have fairly dramatic consequences, right? So you have to very carefully talk in the language that these controllers understand. You have to meter yourself with the right bandwidth limitations. Be very careful not to tip them over. And that's why we've developed some of the technology of Tenable OT, is to make sure we can give that visibility, in a safe and reliable manner.
So the tool could be punitive in some cases if it's not used correctly. Is that something you're experiencing here in Australia?
Yeah. Right. We have different tool sets. So the recommendation, you mostly don't take something like our Nessus scanner that's developed really for corporate environments and go to town.
Don't go running an Nmap or a Nessus scanner in an OT environment. You'll not be making friends.
It's a different sort of, you have different sensors and different approaches based on what you're looking at. With all the safety, the availability requirements in OT, it's a different sort of product set that's really built from the ground up to be safe to use, and a different approach to collecting information. But
in an OT environment, passive is your friend.
Yeah.
Right. So are we, this is the question, Mark, in our, and we have a growing OT and IIoT practice, do we have the skills internally to support our customers' requirements? And that are we
Yeah, of
bringing in the
course. I
right
mean,
people to
yeah.
do it? And are we getting those opportunities to help customers?
We have over 40, if not close to 50 people that have worked in OT environments, have a background in OT environments, and have done all kinds of testing, from literally following the input and outputs on a chip, on a board, to see if they could subvert that flow and do things to testing environments and working with compliance and the various different standards that are coming out. And have been around for a few years. So yeah, absolutely.
Look, a great impact. Last point?
Oh, no, and even getting back to your visibility piece, I mean, it is key, right? Because if you're trying to manage risk, which is what vulnerability management is really about, you can't manage risk if you don't know what you don't know, if you don't know what's plugged into the network. And it's even a common theme when we talk to our OT clients. Like, even though the platforms can do a lot in terms of vulnerability management, threat detection, often the initial use case is, Jeff, we've got these old spreadsheets, we've got these out-of-date network diagrams, we just don't know what's even there. So that initial, just map the network for us, show us what's there, is just really a key starting point.
It's another challenge in OT environments, because a lot of the time the assets aren't actually active. So they are there, but they're only communicating maybe once every X amount of time. And unless you happen to be watching right at that particular moment in time, you're not going to know that device is actually there. So I think it's 30% or something like that. It's actually quite a high number. Don't get me wrong, on the IT side of things, you'll have a similar problem, but it's not as critical as on the OT side of things.
Marty, you've heard the Australian experience. Is that similar for, again, other markets?
It is. So this lack of visibility into these OT environments, I believe, is a global issue that everybody faces, regardless of what vertical or what industry they're in. I would like to touch on something Mark said in his combination of, these devices are often inactive or dormant, right? They can sit quiet on the network for quite a while. And he also used a phrase, he said, in OT, passive is your friend. Well, you really need to be able to elicit the information out of these devices in a way that is safe and reliable. So the active device query technology that Tenable has pioneered, essentially what we do is we communicate with the PLC or the controller in its own native language. So if it's a Siemens device or a Rockwell device or a Schneider device, we communicate with it in that own manufacturer's language. So it's a very simple question. We ask the controller, hey, how are you? What's your firmware level? What's your patch status? And it sends this information back in a timely manner. So it's not really a scan per se. It's more of a between devices. And in that way, we can get much more detailed and granular information out of these devices than you can by simply listening to the network in a passive mode only.
Good. Thanks, Marty. I mean, good. And again, a global issue, not specific to Australia and New Zealand. So, I guess what we're coming down to is I guess the reality that there have been attacks, there have been impacts on critical infrastructure. There's been some pretty well-known ones in Eastern Europe. I think there's been others, in the United States and even here in Australia. Do you want to take us, without fear, uncertainty, and doubt, but some of the realities of the attacks, who's perpetrating, what's their purpose, and the types of environments that is creating that opportunity for them?
Yeah, absolutely. And, without going down the fear, uncertainty, and doubt path, I've been in this cybersecurity for operational technology or industrial control system business for now over 15 years. And back then, we would have to look at natural disasters or some sort of, other form to explain to people what could the effects of these kinds of attacks be. And now, of course, we have some demonstrated ones, such as the power outages in the Ukraine in 2015, 16, and 17 that you referred to, which were nation state, level attacks on a power grid. These systems really were somewhat, I guess, protected by the fact that these protocols were so obscure that, it was this security by obscurity concept. But in reality, we showed that it was very easy to manipulate those industrial controllers to make them do what you wanted. Now, in the overall threat landscape, I'm less worried about what a nation state is going to do to a particular company, because that's highly targeted. What I'm more concerned about is the rise of criminal ransomware. And these ransomware operators are often using known vulnerabilities in devices to get their presence on the networks and then encrypt and lock up your devices. We've seen some significant millions and millions of dollars of losses in the manufacturing industries because of the lack of protection for those types of cases. And I think that once these criminals understand that these environments are worth more to them, they can charge a higher ransom, that we're just going to continue to see that rise. So that, for me, that's the biggest threat right now that industry faces is criminal ransomware.
Okay, thank you. And here on the ground, any context for, impact on, in Australia? I think there are ones that are known, and there are ones that the incident occurs. It is mitigated, quietly, and because they're not public, there's no obligation to send that information out. That is a reality that will change with the SOCI reformation. But what do you see on the ground here in Australia?
It is harder from that perspective. No one really likes to talk about their own little security incidents and end up on the front page. So it's hard to get some of those insights. But the nature of the attacks, and we haven't talked about this much yet, but and even that security by obscurity or weird little protocols, and people think they're okay. But there's one element of that whole converged IT OT landscape that we haven't really talked about. And that's just the fact that there's a big chunk of IT assets sitting in these OT networks as well, right? So they're often the entry point for these breaches, and so they're sort of low-hanging fruits that you can focus on and fixing up. So it's not all about the obscure industrial protocol. Sometimes the big weakness or the threat vector that gets you into these things is just that unpatched Windows server that's been your jump host into your OT network, and you haven't patched it in the last 5 years. So those sorts of issues as well.
We've seen some accidental ransomware effects where the attacker thought they were in the corporate environment, and then at some stage figured out they were in an OT environment, which obviously increases the likelihood that someone's going to pay, because if you can't ship your trucks or you can't get your widgets out, you're more likely to pay that ransom. So we've seen ransoms go from a few $1,000s, which is not unusual for a corporate environment or even a smaller business, go to several million after the attacker realized that they were in an OT environment. And we've seen upticks in them actively looking for OT devices within and IoT devices within an environment to attack. Yeah.
And the consequences are so much higher, both from a safety perspective and monetary. I mean, take an aluminium smelter offline, it may not come back online, type of thing. Those sorts of massive consequences.
So given the criticality of those systems, right? It's in the manufacturing, and now we're going to expand that to the communications sector, financial services, way beyond just, energy, water, and power, for example, transport, health. Given that, how do you recommend, or what are your observations been? How do you raise the awareness within your organization to get the budget, to get the attention? Legislation will do some of the work, but other than that, maybe Marty, I'll go to you, because you've been, both you and Jeff been, practitioners where you've had to raise awareness. What would you recommend to those who are spending some time with us today are the best ways to raise the awareness to the management layer of the organizations they work in?
Yeah, it's a multifaceted or multi-pronged effort, I think. I'm seeing a lot of recognition by boards of directors and those with fiduciary responsibility over organizations, that they're going to the chief information security officer and they're telling her, hey, you need to take responsibility and accountability here and understand where this risk lies for our company. So that's kind of a top-down approach. Kind of a bottom-up approach is that I think for the OT engineers and for the security InfoSec professionals that want this awareness. I had a coworker that told me, he said, he would come to me when I was his boss and he would say, he'd tell me something. Hey, this security vulnerability exists, or we have this risk. And I say, well, why are you telling me that? And he says, I don't want to be the most senior person that knows. So I think a lot of it that we didn't take into consideration when we were connecting these environments back in the late 90s or before is we connected them without considering what the risk was to the corporation. And engineers at that time, such as myself, that were very junior people in the organization, decided to connect a modem into the OT system, decided to connect the networks together. And really, that decision should be made by someone much more senior in the company. So I think for the junior people, it's a matter of just telling them that, hey, we have these Windows XP devices out here running, or we have these legacy control system environments that are running, and they're a risk to our company. And now that you know that, you should do something about it. So I think it's about visibility, and it's making sure that the right people are aware of the problem, and then they'll start turning the resources on to start to take care of that risk, because the risk continues to grow with time, and eventually we're going to have to address it.
So to be completely fair, in the OT environments, if we wind the clock back a whole bunch of years, a lot of the attacks that we're seeing today, they just weren't around. I mean, the attacks evolve, etc. So managing essentially risk in the OT environment, it's getting to the point where we now have to consider that much more than we did a few years ago. And thankfully, certainly I've seen it where the OT part of the business is certainly communicating much better and more often with the IT side of things, and actually understanding each other as well. So the IT guys need to understand that OT environments are different. Things are more critical. They can't necessarily go as fast as other things. And vice versa, OT is realizing and understanding that, we do need to fix some of these things because the world is different now.
Mark raises some really good points there, and we talk about convergence in OT and IT, but sometimes there's this lack of convergence just from an architecture and conversation between the IT and OT teams. I think it's getting a lot better, but you do see it still, like where often you're going, like I'm going to customers and you're talking to the corporate team, and then I'm talking to the OT team, and I'm sort of the bridge between telling them what each other are doing, sort of thing. So still a bit of that, but I think we're getting a lot better, and the need for that convergence.
That's a side effect from SOCI as well, because it's now kind of enveloping a whole bunch of industries that typically, were happily ticking along. They're now getting this focus on there, and that's going to necessitate that interaction between the two teams.
Yeah. And Phil, getting back to your original point about some practical advice, searching for budgets and how do you do all those things. It's a bit of a two-edged sword sometimes, because the people that control the dollars often want a lot of facts and figures and some quantitative data to justify, why should we do any of this? Why should we spend this money? So, and sometimes you don't know what you don't know. So often would say, as a practical thing, you can just take sort of our platforms from an eval perspective, go and get the data, because it just helps you quantify the magnitude of the problem.
Let's
go and
then bring it back to what Marty was saying, which is manage it based on risk.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. Now let's go to where the facts and figures that people often look, and that's Gartner. And I did a little research here, and there was a strategic planning assumption. And the assumption, I think, for one of the facts was that, again, according to Gartner analysts, by 2025, so just 4 short years away, 75% of OT security solutions will be delivered via multifunctional platforms interoperable with IT. So even the analysts see it coming. It is on the horizon, whether or not government legislates it, and it's directly affected by some important vectors of late. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought operational resilience to the forefront. So whether it be a ship stuck in the Suez Canal, or manufacturing plants coming to a halt because of some ransomware. I think even as consumers, we've become much more familiar with supply chain, right? We know that we're on the horizon will be a supply. The supply of chipsets is going to keep cars from being delivered at the same pace we've had in the past. That the threats are on the rise and rising, and Marty, you spoke well to that, I think, and that more vulnerabilities are surfacing as the convergence occurs. So I liked their assumption. So they've delivered a few additional facts which I think were important. And this is according to a study, an in-depth study of CVE discovery time and inconsistencies for managing risks in critical infrastructure Marty, you may have been an author to this. I'm sure you participated. But what they notably found was, on average, they found vulnerabilities that existed, in that OT environment, in the wild, they call it, for 1,800 days before those vulnerabilities were discovered. And the average time to assess and assign a score, a CVSS score, to the CVE is 135 days, right? And so I think what they've called out is, there are some facts and figures. Now, what does that mean to a board, to a management team? We need to translate that into dollars and dollar potential impact. And they've got it's interesting journey that they have, a six-state journey or phase that Gartner believes is where most organizations are. And Marty, you can maybe attest to this. But phase one in awareness is where 60% of enterprise and government organizations deemed critical, are in their phase, in their path to OT security. And I kind of like when you get to phase three is the oh wow moment, they call it. And the oh wow moment, according to them, is when unmanaged devices connecting everywhere is discovered. So again, I think we just relate it back to where we are. The OT network isn't segmented as well as we thought it was.
That's what we were talking about before,
Right.
is these different interconnections between the corporate environment and the OT environment that are surprise.
And I think, we've all lived through this of late, or at least, our friends at Microsoft have. Windows XP is still everywhere, right? It's still an adopted operating system as well. So then it moves to firefighting, getting the budget, bringing the teams together, integrating them, and finally phase 6, where only 10% of organizations are at today, according to Gartner, is optimization. So does that play back to you at all, Marty? Do you think that's an accurate depiction by Gartner?
Yeah, I do. I mean, if I go back and kind of highlight some of the comments that you made, you talked about the length of time these vulnerabilities exist. And we've talked about the fact that some of these operational environments, can be difficult to patch. These are legacy devices. They don't behave well with traditional vulnerability management programs. And I've even heard people say, well, I really don't need to know what vulnerabilities are in my environment because it's going to take me years to patch them anyway. And my argument is that no, you do need to know. You must know, and you have to do your due diligence. Just because you can't fix it, Patch Tuesday comes out. Just because you can't fix it by Wednesday doesn't mean that you shouldn't be aware that that vulnerability exists in your system and can schedule, some upgrades at the appropriate time. And that might be 6 months down the road. But you should schedule it, you should be aware of it, and you should be taking those incremental proactive steps to try to address those. And we just must make these systems harder from the inside out. We can no longer simply rely on perimeter protection or things like that. We must make these systems more resilient because, quite frankly, it is the critical national infrastructure of our countries that rely on them. So they must be more secure.
And then just picking up from what you were saying, Marty, that's why it's so important to start thinking about your vulnerability management program, or probably more correctly, your risk management program, which involves managing vulnerabilities. Looking at that program and making sure that you have the people, the processes, the technology, the kind of the buzzwords in that side of things, but making sure that certainly the processes, and OT's generally been always really good at having good processes in place. So this should fit right well in there. Making sure that they're consistent, making sure that your results are consistent. But more importantly, once you have the information, is categorizing, prioritizing, and what we call internally bite-sizing it. So categorize it, making sure, is this a configuration issue? Is this an actual bug in something that we need to fix? Is it in controller side? Is it in HMI side? Is it somewhere else? Is it in a historian? Can I fix it? Should I fix it? That's also a choice. So once you have that information, you can start looking at what is important for your particular environment. And I suspect that might be why sometimes CVEs take a long time to categorize and give a number to, because what's important and critical in one OT environment, in another OT environment,
Right.
Yeah. not so important. So the bite-sized component, just like I said, the internal kind of way of putting it. If I go to an OT environment or even an IT environment and say, here's 1,000 things for you to fix, it's going to be like my kitchen sink, right? if the sink is full, I go, yeah, I can do that tomorrow. Yeah, I can do that the day after. I'll get to it. But if there's just one dish there, I'll go, yeah, I can fix that. So same thing, bring it down to smaller work packages will mean that you actually have a chance of getting things fixed. And by prioritizing it, making sure that you are focusing on the things that are really important for your environment. And as Marty says, if you can't fix it, that's okay. All right. But you need to know that you can't fix it and then potentially look for methods to protect that from the threats that are current at this particular moment in time. So that's important.
And it is a really important point. And, from a practical sense, when I'm talking to customers, we'll have some say, Jeff, you want to come and talk to us about OT security and those things, but I know if you put that in, you're going to tell me I need to upgrade all the firmware on my routers and switches. I have to upgrade all the firmware on the PLCs. And there's this general perception that vulnerability management is about fixing everything, right? To the point that some people refuse to put scanners in or do anything, even in corporate, because they say, no, we don't want the visibility because we know we can't fix it. And that's not really what VM's about. We call it risk-based vulnerability management, and it's really about what Mark's saying. It's about you do want absolutely the visibility. Okay, you want the information. You want to understand where those vulnerabilities and risks are, but it doesn't mean you have to go and fix everything because it's just not practical. You may never be able to upgrade the firmware on your PLCs, but it is about having a risk-based methodology so you can justify those decisions, right? So you can justify what I am going to fix, what I'm not going to fix, but it's mostly a good opportunity in this forum to get that off the table or get that scare factor out of there. It's not about fixing everything.
It's one of the areas where you can't be perfect, and even if you are perfect, you're not. All right, because and this is a discussion that we have a lot with IT managers and CISOs in organisations, because the conversation I have is, Mark, we're not seeing that vulnerability line shift much. I can see it dip, and I can see it come back up, and I can see it dip a little bit, and then it goes up a lot. Right. Yes, that's the nature of this particular part of cybersecurity, which is you fix things that are critical to your organizations, and strangely enough, the attackers will come up with a new way of doing other things. So the vulnerabilities come back up again. You fix them, they'll come back up. So it'll be a little bit of a wave coming through. If you're expecting vulnerabilities down, that is never going to happen. You'll see it dip, you'll see it rise, you'll see it dip. So it's making sure that you have control and you have that visibility and you have that knowledge to make an informed choice.
You cannot control what you don't know. Very good. Thanks. Thanks for that. I think this last bit of a subject here is those on the call in organizations who are taking some positive steps, making some investments, and identifying their vulnerabilities in their OT environment and doing the convergence. It does introduce some risks. Yeah. And I kind of wanted to explore that a little bit. I think the three of us here, the four of us, that those risks, those OT, risks. What are the things? And I'll turn to you, Jeff, actually, if I could, because you've been doing it here in Australia. And what are the things that you see and that you support customers around in that risk area of converging those two environments?
Yeah, there's mostly two risk areas where we talk about just OT IT convergence risk. When you look at our platforms, we can look at lots of risk elements apart from that, whether you're talking about rogue assets or unauthorized conversations, unauthorized changes to PLC, those sorts of things. But in this space, you've got the two main issues, right? The need to have the connectivity between OT and IT, so allow some traffic, but also the need to have the separation. So how do you manage that risk? How do you have eyes on, well, have I got that separation done well enough? Am I seeing flows that shouldn't be there? What pathways really exist between that PLC and the outside network? So some of the practical things we can do with some of our platforms is just make it easier with some of the visualization tools, if I can get that word out, just to let them visualize, pick the PLC, map out, well, what is actually talking to that, or have the ability to analyze a lot of the passive traffic through the network and say, show me an attack vector. Can I get from this PLC out through the corporate or inbound the other way? So, for us, it's about providing them with some, nice, simple graphical tools just to help with that analysis and visualizations. Of course, a lot of these networks are massive and they've been around for a long time. So it's very hard to get your head around it. And you can sit there and crawl through firewall rules and all those sorts of things, but it's a very hard way to do it. as one example.
So, I think a couple questions, I think, to Marty and Jeff here. You're part of a publicly traded, company at Tenable, and hey, congratulations on your Q1 results, a 20% increase overall on Monday announcement. So that was pretty positive. You're an investment by Tenable and the shareholders in OT in particular. Are you seeing a big uptake? Are you spending a lot of time in front of prospects and customers today? And then over to Marty, tell me about the future, the roadmap for Tenable in investing in supporting IT vulnerability or OT vulnerability. Sorry.
It's okay. I assumed you meant OT. It's not a problem. I think that this is a critically important area for us, and we wouldn't have made that investment if our customers hadn't been driving us towards that. So some of the world's biggest companies, and certainly they operate in the Australia, New Zealand region, came to us and they said, the risk that these OT environments pose to our company is such that we need this visibility. And so, the acquisition of Indegy, which turned into the Tenable OT product, has been paramount there. You may also have heard in the news this week that the acquisition of the Active Directory security company, Alsid, has also gone through. And I'm really excited about that because Active Directory is another whole topic we could have another webinar on that OT does not typically do very well. There needs to be some help there. I think one of the issues that we continue to see within OT, especially with regards to this "I can't fix it" mentality, is that you have to have some automation to help you make those prioritization decisions. It's no longer sufficient to run around with a clipboard to try to figure out what assets you have. It's no longer sufficient to try to look at the vulnerability database from the certs around the world and figure out for yourself which ones are the most important. You've got a limited amount of time with a limited amount of person power available to fix these things. So you need to have some help there in the terms of automation on the security side. And that's why I'm continued to be excited about this as a solid place to continue to run my career in. I think it's important work that we do every day to secure these systems.
Do you foresee some more additional investment and perhaps acquisitions, on the roadmap for Tenable in that space?
Well, what I'll say is, as a publicly traded company, I can't provide any forward-leaning statements like that. But I would expect that the OT area is continuing to be important for us, and we certainly are having the conversations with a number of the global corporations in Australia, as well as global governments. One of my roles in sort of the strategic or relationship side is to work with different governments on what they're doing and what are the impacts going to be to their industry. And so I look forward to continuing to working with the Australian government in that regard.
Thanks, Marty. Anything else there? I think it's important to point out that industry is responding, and it not only did Tenable make an acquisition, Apollo, Microsoft, the list is long of organizations that recognize that there's opportunity and a demand, from that, and industry is responding, which is something we should be proud of, as being part of that.
Lots of conversations on it, and we're very busy in the sector.
Good.
Talking to all the customers.
Hey, let's make sure that our audience is if they have any questions, they're putting in the Q&A box. We really are coming to the end, and an opportunity to actually put your questions directly to Mark, Jeff, and Marty, if you could. Let's see, Janet, am I going to get those from yourself? Terrific, because we'll move to that, I think, at this point. So, question number one, and open to all the panel here: what are the major impediments to running a successful vulnerability management program, not specific to OT, but OT and IT? Who wants to take that?
I can jump in first.
Please. There we go.
Basic things, right? Lack of visibility is the key one, right. or even making the decision. Same thing. You don't want to fix all this stuff, so you won't even bother getting the visibility. So lack of visibility is a big one, because you really need it. You want to make those informed decisions. Practical things within the company, because obviously we can go in, we can give you that visibility, but that tie-in with your other groups that are doing remediation work. Sometimes there's zero communication there. So really important, getting back to Mark's comments about the people, the process, the tech. It's not just about our solution. You can put it in and scan till the cows come home. But if you don't have that process tied up with your people that have to do the remediation and give them some practical advice as to what to do, you'll get nowhere with it, and they'll get no traction with their VM program at all.
What do you see? Impediments?
Impediments, other than visibility, there's obviously that lack of communication and not fixing things.
Right.
That's probably going to be the one that makes things fail the most.
The inability to prioritise this feeling that they're just drowning under this weight of 20, 30,000 vulns, and saying, no, hang on, take a step back. Let's take that risk-based approach to it and really work out how that's going to work for your company.
The best thing an organisation can do is the bite size, but the categorising and the prioritisation, right? So a lot of the time, configuration issues, do we really care, yes or no? Right. Maybe they're easy to fix, maybe they're not easy to fix. Maybe it's configured in that particular way because in your environment, that's how it has to work. Document it. Document it, write it down, so the next time it doesn't become a question anymore whether you need to fix it or not. The answer is no, we don't, because we know and understand why it's there in the first place. So that's important. And then, understanding where your assets are, that's probably one of the key things. If you can't find it, you can't protect it, you can't even make a decision on it.
And Marty, any color to that? Do you want to add to impediments?
Yeah, I would add that if everything's important, then nothing is. So that speaks to the prioritization issue. We talked about the visibility issue. I think that the way I would view that is that it's not just an IT problem, right? You need to have visibility into these OT environments, and you need to bring that back into a common analytical platform. So if you have all these little independent sort of risk management programs going on in these different areas, you're not really helping the entire enterprise, because you could find out that from an enterprise-wide perspective, you should be spending all your time on this one business unit because they're the most vulnerable and the riskiest part. But we're spending time over here because we didn't have the ability to analyze that data across the entire enterprise. So that speaks to why Tenable has made such investments in this. So no matter if you're in a OT environment or a mobile environment or a container environment or a cloud-based environment, we can give you the visibility into those environments so that you can analyze it as a whole.
There's probably one more thing I would like to add to that is I would encourage those that are in OT environments to sometimes challenge their vendors, because a lot of the time the vendors for specific pieces of kit or a ecosystem will say, you can't possibly do anything to that environment because it won't be certified, it'll be invalidated, our technicians won't understand it or something. There'll be a reason why the vendor says you can't do this to that environment. And that may be legitimate, but I encourage people just challenge that and ask them why. And if they can't come back with a sensible answer, then perhaps you can actually fix things in that particular environment. We've seen HMI environments where the vendor has said you can't possibly patch this system. In that particular case, it was just a Java application. So as long as you didn't break Java, you could do anything you like to the rest of the workstation. It would work perfectly well. Now that's just a simplified answer, but don't be afraid to talk to your Schneiders, your Honeywells, and say, well, why can't we patch this, update this, reconfigure this, etc., to remove some of those risks?
Okay, so my takeaway, on that answer was good. There are lots of impediments, and vulnerability, a visibility of what's there is clearly number one. But some of the ways to improve the outcomes there or reduce the risks, again, was document what you will and won't be patching and making vulnerable. And then I think this last point was really validative. Let's question and challenge. Challenge the environment, the environment.
To be fair to the vendors, they have been changing their tunes over the last few years, but certainly there are still some around where you don't touch my stuff.
Talking to a lot of the customers, they actively focus on that issue too, to the point that, when they're looking at all their contracts with the vendors as they get into new arrangements, they're going to make sure they bake in the requirements and the security that we can update things, right, and not really take that position all the time.
Good. Now, in the interest of time, just keep it going here. A quick question. And so, auditors around what frameworks, ISO 27001, NIST, the Essential 8, those kind of things. Can you ignore anything on that list, because the list is long, and how do you go about that? First, I'll go to Jeff, and then I go to Mark, because this is what we do for a living at CyberCX.
Yeah. This is a little bit tongue in cheek about, and it gets back to the risk-based vulnerability management, and really rounding that out. And how can you convince an auditor that I only need to fix these vulnerabilities on these things. I'm not going to worry about this stuff. And risk-based vulnerability management, it's about getting all that data. It's about the prioritization. But the practical missing step sometimes is that people just don't document that this is how we're going to make the decision.
Okay.
And we have this, and we do it to ourselves in security. We have these rubbish standards that just say, we're going to fix criticals in 2 weeks. No one defines what critical is or what's high risk for the company. So it's that simple process to tie things together to make sure you have a documented, doesn't have to be big war and peace, risk document that explains, yes, we've got all this visibility, we know about all these vulnerabilities, but this is how we've made that decision to we're just going to fix that.
Make it local for us now.
Well,
what do we do?
It's really easy. This is how you pass an audit, right?
Right.
And this is an audit on any particular framework. It doesn't really matter. Right. Okay. Obviously, understand the framework that you're trying to work with, but you document your process of what you're doing. We are doing A, B, and C. Before we connect a device, something between OT and IT, we look at 3 things. We look at, do we really need it? Yeah. Right. Okay. If we do, which direction is the traffic going to go? Is it going to go from OT to IT, or is it push or pull, essentially? Okay. Right. What are the risks around doing this? Okay. Document that. Have issues that are raised, have them documented, write them down, write down the results, write down your decision. When the auditor comes along and says, why did you make this decision? Here you go, here's the answer. How did you make that decision? Well, I've got a process here that tells you exactly. So an auditor will generally be happy if they can follow the steps and come to the same conclusion that you did. Okay. Now they can argue saying, well, I reckon it should be a high or a very high risk, but it's not their environment, right? It's your environment. You understand it. You know what's critical and what's not critical. Okay, write down the steps. As long as they're getting to the same results, they should accept your findings.
Good. So, moving on. So they really liked Marty's philosophy of knowing your vulnerabilities through you can't fix it. So, Marty, can you expand on the comment, because it's a big call?
Yeah, I certainly can. So if you have vulnerabilities in, for example, a programmable logic controller, and you know that programmable logic controller, is so critical to your operation that you can't shut it down to patch it for a certain amount of time, what you should be doing is mapping out the different pathways that perhaps other devices use to communicate to that controller. And, I think Jeff mentioned it earlier, in that you'll find that maybe you can patch or can put some defense in depth type mitigations in those outlying devices, right? So you may not be able to patch the main vulnerability in the controller, but you can certainly harden the environment around it as a mitigating step until you can have the opportunity to patch it. And Tenable OT will certainly help you map those different attack vectors out and provide you the insight into which ones are most important. We talked about while you were talking about the auditing conversation, that's why, we have the concept of, asset criticality, right? So that you can actually adjust the relative priorities of these vulnerabilities based on what kind of equipment they're deployed on. Because in some instances, a really high risk a CVSS of 8, 9, or 10, if it's on a minor piece of equipment, might not be that big a deal to you. Whereas another vulnerability that might be a CVSS of 3, 4, or 5 might be very critical if it's on a very high risk piece of equipment.
Thanks, Marty. Now we have one last question, and I think this is really well directed at yourself, actually, and I think it's an important one. And I think we go outside your role of vice president of OT at Tenable, into your advisory roles, as part of the working group. Should there be expectations that component suppliers of OT, that they have protection? What's their level of maturity and understanding of cyber protection when providing, equipment? What's their maturity?
The maturity has improved significantly in the 15 or so years that I've been doing this. If you went back into the old days, you would be a vulnerability researcher and you would call one of their companies and say, "I've discovered a vulnerability in your software." You'd be transferred to the lawyer's office and saying that, well, you're violating our terms of use by reverse engineering our code. I'm happy to say that most of the major OEM equipment providers that we've been discussing today, have fairly well established vulnerability disclosure programs. They're working with the research community. Tenable itself has a large research department that does zero-day research on devices like this. And we have found that we have pretty good relationships with the vendors. We have agreements with several of the vendors to be the preferred supplier of cybersecurity products, and they sell them through their channels. So I think that the conversation's improved a lot. I still think there's some room to improve some more, but I'm happy with the trajectory that we're on.
Room for improvement in that space, I would suggest.
All right. Well, listen, thanks everybody for joining. Thanks for taking the time with us. I want to thank Tenable, Marty, Jeff, and Mark, for joining us. You'll find a recording will be posted. Do go to the Tenable website. Tenable OT has some good documentation, some references that would be worthwhile. Then do contact us at CyberCX. Thanks for your time, and have a good day.